So it was almost 6 years ago, almost to the day, that Rob Califf joined Kathy, Lawrence, and I for breakfast at a hotel in Palo Alto. I think everyone had the frittata. Kathy went, I think, egg whites only. And we brought up the idea of this summit to Rob, and he was immediately supportive. He had been commissioner for about a year. There had been an election. Things were in flux. Who could have guessed what was to come? But Rob's back in that role, an amazing person for that role, and really, it's just so great to have him here in person today for our first year in review talk, which we hope will become an annual event. So Rob's going to open the meeting with FDA year in review. Rob.
Thanks, Cool Dev. And if I look a little tired, I've been spending the last 4 days helping my wife keep 4 grandkids, age 1, 3, 7, and 9. I'm a little out of practice, freshly from Denver, but it's great to be back in California and San Francisco, where I've spent about 7 years of my life, and a lot of great friends here. Good to see all of you. I do have this thing that I just cannot follow instructions, so I'm going to talk about the year in review, but really from the perspective of where we're going, not spending a lot of time looking through the rearview mirror. First, just to sort of put things in perspective from the way I look at them, just to remind everybody about the expanse of what the FDA has to regulate. It's about 20 to 25% of the economy. It not only includes, I would guess most of you are on the medical product side of things, but in addition to drugs, devices, and biologics, food. Remember, the F in FDA stands for food. I'll say more about that in a minute. And we have the newcomer, tobacco, which is only 13 years in the making, the Center for Tobacco Products. We have cosmetics, where a law was, as part of the omnibus, was just passed. It gives us a bit more ability to figure out what's going on in the world of cosmetics. And as a cardiologist, I'd never thought much about it until 2015-16, but there are a lot of really interesting and complex issues there. And of course, you have dietary supplements. And if you can tell me about what's in dietary supplements, I'd love to know, because it's very hard for us, given the existing laws, to figure it out. And when you look at the remit of the FDA, in the mission statement and in the laws that are written as they've evolved, of course, safety is the number one priority, but right there with safety in the same sentence is promoting innovation. And it's really the balance of those two things, which I think is the most fascinating and hardest part of the FDA. I love it. As many of you know, I was an intensive care doc for most of my career. You have to make decisions on the fly with whatever information you have available, and if you say we're going to ponder this for 24 hours, often the patient's no longer there to discuss it. And in a very similar way, in a slightly different time frame, of course, the FDA has to make a lot of decisions in the face of imperfect information, but it does make decisions, and many of them are mandated by law with time frames that people expect. But I'd also stress a couple of other parts of the mission. The tobacco one is special, and I'll mention that a couple more times before I finish. In the mission statement is helping people understand how to use products safely and effectively. Now, communication is an enormously difficult issue. And the way it sort of crystallized for me in 2016 is when we were just working on the food label issue with Michelle Obama. One of our people said, you realize we have X amount of space, and it's very small. It's got to speak to 320 million people who speak different languages at different levels of education and at different ages. And of course, it's gotten a lot more complicated in my thinking about that with some things I'll talk about in a minute. And then, of course, in 2016, I always included emergency preparedness as a key part of the mission. People looked at me quizzically in 2016. I don't think you do anymore. emergency preparedness, of course, not only includes pandemics, but something we need to be concerned about now, which is nuclear catastrophes that could occur either domestically or globally that we have to be ready for. And you can't prepare for these things just by taking the people who already have a full-time job and saying, add this to your workload, and yet, to a large extent, that's what we've been asked to do. So as I look back at the last year, it's interesting, the title of this talk, because the executive committee at the FDA asked me to sort of give a recounting of my first almost year on the job. I was confirmed in February of this past year. And so I had a chance to think about it, and I'll give you sort of a public version of what I had to say then. First of all, just briefly looking back, I think it's really important to take into account that all the federal agencies dealing with health have had to deal with an unprecedented pandemic at the same time that everything else is going on. There have been increased resources, nowhere near the amount needed to comfortably do the job. And as I look back at the FDA, it was quite remarkable in the area of technology, how things were taken care of, while also all the special needs of the pandemic had to be dealt with. There was, I would say, too many process fouls that occurred within the FDA that led to a lot of public examination, which is fine because it's given us the sort of burning platform to make some changes that were long needed at the FDA, and I'll say a few words about that. And I would say in terms of victories, the three things I'll just briefly mention. First, if you look at the technology part of dealing with the pandemic, after a lot of complexity in the beginning, essentially we've armed the world from the point, mostly driven by the United States, with diagnostic capabilities, vaccines, and therapies that all work for this virus. And we've had to adapt and change as the virus has changed. And in my view, we've kept up with it from the point of view of the FDA's mission. Secondly, I'm going to come back to that in a second. Secondly, we did get the user fees negotiated. And, I publicly said I would much prefer it if the taxpayers paid for the FDA services directly, but that's not in the works. And if we had to rely particularly on the Congress that was just elected to fund the FDA, I can tell you wouldn't have much of an FDA to work with. And so, and what I will say about the user fees, which I think is a very big deal, much more than you would think from the outside, is that the discipline of budgeting that occurs when you work directly with the industry, and the industry is supporting it, leads to two things. One is much more discipline on the FDA side, which I think is very helpful. But also, the industries that pay user fees are very much vested in our success. And you can feel that when you're in the meetings. The discussions are not pounding the desk about how much quicker can you approve our products. It's really, what do you need in order to get the job done? And I found those discussions to be very good. I'll still just say again, in my ideal world, the taxpayers would pay for the FDA, the customer would be the public, the industries would be, of course, important, but that's not in the works anytime in the near future. And then finally, we have the omnibus, which for those of you who are sort of FDA aficionados, you know that we had a number, every 5 years when the user fees come up, you know it's going to get passed, because if it doesn't get passed, people won't get their products reviewed. And we always have a lot of things to fix in legislation at that point. But the way it happened, the user fees got passed with no legislation attached that was going to help us. And it looked pretty bad, but miraculously in the omnibus, a lot of what we wanted to get done got done, and I'm very happy about that. I think there'll be discussions, I'm sure, in some detail later today about accelerated approvals, and there's some interesting legislation there in addition to cosmetics and other things. But I think the FDA has actually done a pretty good job with its mission. Beyond the FDA, I don't know how you can look at this and say that our country is doing its job in terms of health and healthcare. We're currently presiding over the biggest decline in life expectancy since 1918. A lot of it due to not using the tools that are available in the pandemic, but a lot of it due to this emerging onslaught of both the opioid epidemic that was just referred to, but also a common chronic disease. We're seeing increases in death rates from common diseases that we thought we had taken care of. And I don't think this is mostly a failure of technology. We're supplying the world with technology. It's just figuring out in other high-income countries how to use the technology a lot better than we are. Right now, there's a 5-year difference in life expectancy between the U.S. and the average of other high-income countries. Hard to say what's going on in China, but there are at least a couple of publications claiming that we've fallen below China in life expectancy now. And we've got to figure out what to do about the next part. Just inventing technology doesn't assure that we're going to have the health outcomes that we want and need. So what about learning from the past year and looking forward? I got 2 minutes left. How much longer can I go?
Take your time.
Okay.
You're good.
I think you're waiting on the Congresswoman or something.
We're good.
Okay.
Take 7.
7, okay. All right, let's look forward. And I have several things that I regard as no option for the FDA going forward, particularly this year. Number one on that list is human foods. I think it's just a fact that the food side of the FDA has been underappreciated, under-resourced, under-attended to. There is a lot of work to do. We have a plan. It'll be announced in January and February. Just so you know, I'm meeting with you medical types today, but most of my week out here is going to be meeting with the agricultural types. California is feeding a large part of the world and the United States right now, and there's a lot in play to make the system better. Number 2 is tobacco, and I'd say a lot. Let me just say also about foods, it's not just the safety of foods. If you look at these common chronic diseases that are out of control in the U.S., for example, there was just a publication that we're estimated to have over 500,000 teenagers with type 2 diabetes within the next 20 years. Hard to imagine. The basis for this really starts with nutrition, where we've got real problems in this country. Tobacco. I think, it's 13, the Center for Tobacco Products is 13 years old. We've made a lot of progress. Defining progress as only having 47 million Americans who use tobacco products, to me, is not sufficient. We got to do better. We're going to lose almost 500,000 Americans this year to tobacco-related illness. So I sort of, in 2015, came to the FDA thinking, as a cardiologist, we knew what to do. Problem was taken care of. Let's go forward. But we're not there. And we've got a lot of work to do with not only increases in regulation of various types, and it's going to be much argued about in the public. For example, if we lower the level of nicotine that's allowable in products, if it's almost impossible to get addicted to tobacco products or vaping, how many people would want to do it? There are going to be many discussions about that. But also the enforcement of what we have, which is a very complex set of issues that I don't have time to go into. 2 of them are only of interest to those who really follow the FDA closely: enterprise transformation and the workforce. I will mention, I've met several of you here who were at the FDA and have been out working in other areas. But it's obvious that to keep up with industries that are evolving so rapidly, we've got to have really top-notch people at the FDA. And there we did get a nice piece of legislation with the omnibus that allowed us to raise our salaries a bit. We've fallen way behind inflation in the federal government. It doesn't actually even catch us up to inflation, but it's a lot better than we expected. The opioids are a huge problem. And of course, the epidemic is moving rapidly now to one driven by cartels sending chemically produced fentanyl and methamphetamine through the mail and crossing the borders with little small amounts that are very hard to detect. And a lot of teenagers are dying in the U.S. This is something for parents to be hyper aware of, thinking they're getting a party drug in the mail, but getting a dose of fentanyl that can be lethal on the first dose. So a lot of work there. And then, of course, we have the reauthorization of the Emergency Preparedness Bill, so-called PAPA, coming up. And then I'm going to mention 4 things in closing that are must-dos. I have a list of 8 things that are things I'm really interested in, like dietary supplements, that a lot of people think are must-dos, but I won't go into those. Number 1 is supply chain. I was definitely not a supply chain expert coming into this job, but with infant formula, I've learned a lot. But it's true in every commodity that we regulate. I blame this all on consultants, of course, but the American industries have learned just-in-time methodology that leads to very little unused supply in the system. And on the receiving end, entities like UCSF have learned about big contracts that get lower prices. And the combination of those 2 things leads to a situation where when a problem occurs, there is no resilience in the system. It doesn't matter if you're talking about generic drugs, innovator drugs, food. The only one that doesn't seem to have a problem, interestingly, is the tobacco industry. I wish that it was sort of reversed. So the industry has fought us tooth and nail to keep us from having the information that we would need to prepare and to stress test the system in a centralized way. And of course, knowing my background, I'm not in favor of government intervening when things are going well. But if what happens is we have a shortage, like we have right now with children's medications for the respiratory viruses, if the only thing we can do is try to beg for the information we need to figure out what to do across all the various industries, that's just no way to run a country for such vital substances. Number 2 is diagnostic testing. We got that close to new legislation on diagnostic testing, but it was defeated. And I got to say, the academic medical centers were the main lobbies opposed to it. If you think academic medical centers are not lobbies, let me assure you that's not true. And so maybe we'll have a good discussion about that one. But I would argue, having been a clinician most of my career, that we know very little about the quality of diagnostic testing done in a lot of circumstances right now. They're absolutely critical, like which chemotherapy do you get for your cancer? The last 2, misinformation. I'm on the record as saying I think it's the leading cause of death in America today. There's no way to prove that. But if you look at the pandemic, we have vaccines that reduce the risk of death. Now, new data from Israel out yesterday shows an 80% additional reduction in mortality if you get the bivalent vaccine compared to not getting it as a booster. We have antivirals that reduce by another 80 to 90%, but many Americans are not getting these fundamental treatments because there are many people who are arguing that for a whole variety of reasons they shouldn't. But this is not limited to the pandemic. There are many other issues about which misinformation is prevalent. And what's most remarkable about this is that the people promoting misinformation make money by doing it. I blame this on Silicon Valley, of course. You all are out here. I worked at Google for 5 years. I don't think it's intentional by Silicon Valley. We were simply not prepared for what would happen when the snake oil salesmen of the old days, and they actually really did exist, can now reach 1 billion people in a day over the internet. And there is no solution that I can find anywhere about what to do about this. So if you ask me, the number one thing for CERSIs to do would be to come up, and you ought to be doing this, you're in the area. What are we going to do about the problem of misinformation? And then finally, the last one we're going to talk about a lot today is evidence generation. One of my maxims of being at FDA is that the heat generated by a decision is inversely proportional to the quality of the evidence. But as I've already told you, we often have to make decisions with whatever evidence is available, and they can be argued about. But one thing I think is really beautiful about the FDA is that the decisions are made by civil servants who have no financial conflict of interest. That is very well protected, with only rarely, although a commissioner who's a political appointee can overrule the civil servants. It's almost never happened in the history of the FDA, and I think if it ever happens, it should be for a really, really good reason. So I'll stop there. You said I had a little extra time. I hope it was helpful.
No, it was really great, Rob. And stay up there. Maybe there'll be a couple of questions. Yeah, I want to really thank you for that wonderful presentation, but also for giving us all our topics for next year. So we have a little bit of time. If someone wants to come up, we have maybe 5 minutes. Rob, I'll start by asking you. I remember when you were commissioner first time around, you said there were 2,000, I believe, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, there were 2,000 unfilled jobs at the FDA. And how are you doing in terms of filling those jobs? And if you were to fill those jobs, would there be enough money to pay those people? Is that in the budget?
I think it's better to keep this simple. There are complications about the number of jobs and the amount of money and how it gets spent. But basically, the turnover at the FDA has been much lower than I thought it would be. People have really hung in there because, of course, the sense of mission when you're in the middle of a pandemic is quite remarkable. And taking a page from Silicon Valley, we've developed, I think, a very efficient hybrid workplace environment so that it's a pretty good place to work. Our scores in the federal government are at the top of the federal government for job satisfaction. But let's look at where we're going. Just talk about food. We think about rare diseases and genetic engineering. Let's talk about food. And it just goes on and on. We're going to need highly quantitative, capable people in the FDA. And I do think a certain amount of turnover is really good, like people leaving FDA and going outside and people coming back from the outside in.
Well, this is unbelievable. There are no questions for you. We got one. Okay, this is first and final question.
So as far as innovation goes, what else are you taking with you from Google to the FDA?
I'll tell you the thing I wish I could take. The computing environment is, I was spoiled with the computing environment, but the federal computing is a real problem. And there are many reasons why that's the case. I have a son who's in the he's a rocket scientist, and I thought that the defense industry had this figured out because there are really great things coming from the defense industry. What I learned is they just throw money at it until they get what they want. It's not that people have figured out exactly how to make it happen. So, we have some ideas, and I can't say we're settled, but we've got to improve our computing environment. This gets back to what I said about an enterprise transformation. If you have people, we have get your mind wrapped around this, 600,000 entities that we have to regulate when it comes to food. 600,000. Now, if you think an inspector with an iPad hand entering information on an inspection is going to handle that well, you're out of your mind. So we've got to have a different infrastructure.
Excellent, excellent. Rob, thank you so much. And Rob's going to be back on the FDA Chiefs Chat later today, along with Mark McClellan, Scott Gottlieb, and Peggy Hamburg, and Janet and Andy will moderate that. Now we're going to have our first panel. Laura Esserman from UCSF and Patricia Cavazzoni from FDA are going to co-moderate that. I'll ask Laura to introduce her panelists. Laura's coming right up.